Nobody expected this to ever come to light, not after so many years, not after everything that has already been said about Princess Diana. But in a quiet corner of royal archives, something unexpected was found. A sealed envelope, marked with Diana's handwriting. And when King Charles finally saw what was inside, the entire room went silent. Because this wasn't just a letter, it was something far more personal and far more emotional than anyone imagined. It began during a routine review of old royal documents. Staff were sorting through private storage files that had not been opened for years. Among official papers, diaries, and correspondence, one envelope stood out. No official stamp. No formal classification. Just a simple handwriting. Diana. At first, it was assumed to be a personal note, maybe something already recorded in history. But when historians carefully checked the date, they realized something shocking. This letter had never been made public, not even mentioned in royal archives. And protocol required only one thing: it had to be shown to King Charles. When King Charles was handed the envelope, witnesses say he didn't speak for a few seconds. He just looked at it silently. Because whatever was inside, it wasn't just paper. It was memory. He finally opened it. The room stayed completely quiet. As he read line after line, his expression slowly changed. At first calm, then distant, then deeply emotional. No one knows the exact words written inside, but sources suggest it wasn't anger. It wasn't blame. It was reflection and honesty. A letter written at a time when emotions were complicated and life inside the palace was at its most difficult. And as he reached the final lines, King Charles reportedly lowered the letter and remained silent for a long time. What made this letter so impactful wasn't controversy. It was humanity. Princess Diana was known for expressing her truth in private writings. And this letter apparently revealed feelings she never expressed publicly. Not for drama, not for attention, but as a personal release. Royal insiders suggest it contained emotions about isolation, duty, and personal struggle within royal life. But also something unexpected, a sense of understanding rather than anger. That's what made it so powerful. It wasn't an attack. It was closure. After reading, King Charles reportedly stayed in silence for several minutes. No statements. No reactions. Just silence. Those present described the moment as heavy but respectful. It is believed he chose not to share the contents publicly, not out of secrecy, but out of respect for Diana's privacy, even after all these years. Because some letters are not meant for the world. They're meant for understanding. Princess Diana's story has always been remembered in pieces, by headlines, by history, by public memory. But moments like this remind us of something deeper. Behind every public figure, there is a private voice that the world may never fully hear. And sometimes that voice only speaks in a letter, read years too late. And when it finally is, it changes everything. The silence that followed wasn't just in the room where King Charles stood, it echoed across the entire institution. According to those present, no one tried to speak first. Even officials who had spent years working in strict protocol didn't know how to react. It wasn't shock in a dramatic sense, it was something quieter, heavier, like time itself had paused for a moment. Later that same day, the letter was reportedly placed back into secure royal archives. But something had already changed. People close to the situation described King Charles as unusually distant afterward. Not emotional in an obvious way, but reflective. As if the words he had read were not just about the past, but about decisions, choices, and moments that could never be taken back. What made the situation even more striking was that no one outside a very small circle was ever meant to know about this letter at all. There was no public announcement, no official statement. And yet, somehow, the existence of it began to circulate quietly through insider conversations. Not as scandal, but as a reminder that history is never fully as it seems. Because Princess Diana's life has always been interpreted through public moments, interviews, appearances, headlines. But this letter suggested something different existed beneath all of that. A private layer of thoughts that never reached the world. A version of her voice that was never meant for cameras or newspapers, only for understanding. And perhaps that is why it affected King Charles so deeply. Not because it revealed something new, but because it reminded him of something personal that time had slowly buried under years of silence. In the days that followed, there were no visible changes in public appearances. No statements were made. But those observing closely noted a subtle difference in tone during official engagements. A quieter presence. A more restrained expression. As if the weight of memory had settled, but not disappeared. Yet the most powerful part of this story isn't what was said, or even what was written in the letter. It's what remains unknown. Because some parts of history are never fully revealed. They exist only in fragments, in moments, and in private words that were never meant to become public discussion. And maybe that is what makes this letter so significant. Not because it changes everything we know, but because it reminds us that there is always more we will never see. And in the end, that silence says more than any headline ever could. As the days turned into weeks, the story of the letter never reached an official confirmation, yet it continued to live quietly in whispers among those who were closest to royal documentation. No documents were released, no details were clarified, and no one in authority chose to expand on what had been found. And that silence itself became part of the mystery. Because in moments like these, it is often not the content that captures attention, but the reaction it creates. The idea that something written decades ago could still carry emotional weight powerful enough to affect the present. For King Charles, those who observed from a distance noticed something subtle but consistent. A more reserved tone in private meetings. Longer pauses before responses. A sense of reflection that seemed to follow him even after public duties were over. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible enough to be officially noted, but noticeable to those who had known him for years. And yet, life inside the royal institution continued as it always does. Carefully structured. Carefully controlled, where personal emotion rarely crosses into public expression. But this moment was different because it belonged entirely to the past, and yet it still reached into the present. Princess Diana's presence in history has always been powerful, but this imagined discovery of a hidden letter adds another layer to that legacy. A reminder that people are never fully known through headlines alone. That behind every public image, there are private thoughts that may never be shared, and feelings that may never be fully understood. And perhaps that is why this story resonates so strongly. Not because it reveals a final truth, but because it reminds us that truth itself is often incomplete. Letters like this, whether ever confirmed or not, represent something universal. The need to express what cannot always be spoken. The weight of words written in private, never intended for public reading, yet still carrying meaning long after they are gone. And in that sense, the story is no longer just about a letter. It becomes about memory,
about time,
and about the quiet space between what is said and what is forever left unsaid. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories are not the ones that end with answers, but the ones that end with silence. In that silence, the imagination of the world continues to fill the gaps. People begin to wonder what kind of words could carry so much emotional weight that even years later they would still matter. Some imagine it was a message of regret. Others believe it may have been a moment of reflection from a life that was lived under constant public pressure. But none of it is confirmed. And perhaps it never will be. Because not everything written in private is meant to become public history. Still, the story spreads not because of what is proven but because of what it represents. A human moment hidden inside an institution known for formality and restraint. A reminder that even the most carefully guarded lives still contain emotions that never fully disappear. For King Charles, those closest to him describe this period as one of quiet focus. Not change in a dramatic sense, but a shift inward. More time spent in thought. More distance from unnecessary noise. As if the past had briefly stepped into the present and then quietly stepped back again. There is no dramatic ending here. No official statement. No final confirmation of what was written in that letter. Only the idea that something deeply personal was discovered and treated with respect rather than exposure. And maybe that is what gives the story its lasting impact. Because in a world where everything is usually revealed, shared, and explained, this remains different. It stays private, it stays uncertain, and it stays human. Princess Diana's legacy has always been carried through memory, emotion, and interpretation. And whether this letter is ever proven or remains part of storytelling imagination, it continues to reflect something larger than itself. The idea that every person carries thoughts the world will never read, and feelings that history will never fully record. And in the end, that is what makes the story stay alive. Not proof, not detail, but the silence between them. And in that silence, the story finally settles into what it has been all along, not a conclusion, not a revelation, but a reflection. Because whether this letter is ever confirmed or remains part of whispered storytelling, its impact is rooted in something deeper than facts. It speaks to the space between public life and private truth. The space where words are written not for the world, but for the self, where emotions are not performed, but simply felt. For Princess Diana, her life has always been remembered through moments the world witnessed. Smiles in public appearances, speeches, photographs, and headlines that shaped global memory. But stories like this, real or imagined, remind us that what is seen is never the full story. There is always another layer that remains unseen, untouched by cameras or records. And for King Charles, this imagined moment becomes less about a letter and more about time itself. The way the past never truly disappears, it simply changes form. It becomes memory. It becomes reflection. And sometimes, it becomes something that resurfaces unexpectedly, carrying emotions that were never fully resolved. Yet what remains most powerful is not what is written in the letter, but what is left unsaid. Because silence has a way of holding meaning that words sometimes cannot carry. It preserves dignity. It protects privacy. And in certain moments, it speaks louder than any public statement ever could. As the world continues to search for clarity in stories like this, the truth is that not every detail is meant to be uncovered. Some stories exist not to be solved, but to be felt. To remind us that even within the most structured and public lives, there are private moments that belong only to the individuals who lived them. And maybe that is why this story lingers. Not because it changes history, but because it reflects something timeless about human experience itself. The emotions we express, the emotions we hide, and the words we may write, but never share.